out which camera we're going to be coming in on. We're coming in on camera 2. You're over here on this camera, and I'm over here on that camera.
Thanks for that. After 4 years,
Yeah?
thank you.
Okay.
Hey.
Yeah, 4 years. That's pretty amazing. And here you are still watching.
Yeah.
And so thank you for doing that. You're watching Talking Point Live, coming to you from the campus of Dixie State University and the studios of the Community Education Channel. My name is Eric Young.
I'm Jennifer Kohler, and today is September 19, I think.
Well, that was my job.
Yeah,
but
September
I didn't do it well.
19th.
September 19th.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Hard to believe. It was a year ago today. My daughter shipped out to her service in the United States Army, and oh man.
And you've been on pins and needles, high alert. Yeah, ever since.
Crazy, but
Yeah.
wow, what a year. What are we talking about today? You want to?
It was interesting on Monday night at the Eccles Center.
Little debate going on between Chris Stewart and Shireen Ghorbani.
And I would also say between part of the audience and the candidates.
And some
for
fireworks
office.
erupted through there. I was up in Bountiful. I didn't have a chance to attend it. What happened?
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. It was a live broadcast, and so we're in the Eccles Auditorium, and the rules, according to the Utah Debate Commission, are, because it's a live broadcast, they're asking the audience to refrain from applause or any interruptions so that we have more time for the candidates to field questions and make their responses. And it was interesting because there were several moments when I'd say Chris Stewart was making a claim, particularly about the residents of Washington County signing off on the Lake Powell pipeline. That he was in favor of the pipeline because the residents of the county had signed off on it. And there were people in the audience who just could not contain themselves when this claim was made.
So what did you do? Were you jumping up and down? Or?
Well, they were very funny. They were making, saying no, rumblings in the audience, and it got kind of loud a few times when these claims were being made. And then of course we had to be reminded as an audience what the rules were for the televised debate. And
did the moderator have a gavel?
He did not have a gavel. No, thank heavens, because you imagine how noisy that would be, slamming it down by his microphone. No, he did not, but he did turn around and address the audience a couple of times. And we saw some local officials also craning their necks around in disapproval of the ruckus. So that was part of it.
So this was a partisan ruckus, though, sounds like.
It was a partisan ruckus. As a matter of fact, Chris Stewart made a comment after a little while saying, "I'm grateful for my supporters that they are observing the protocol for this
that they're compliant
event.
to the rules of the event."
Yes, yes. So one asks oneself,
did Ghorbani say anything about her supporters?
She did not say anything about her supporters, not their responses, not approving or disapproving, or even acknowledging that they were occurring.
Okay, any nonverbal indication? Maybe
she was pretty stoic up there.
She was,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I
wouldn't want to play poker against her.
Oh,
Yeah,
really interesting. Okay, I'll have to take a look. I haven't
Yeah.
had a chance to see the debate yet,
Okay.
and kind of ill-prepared for this conversation. But
That's okay.
it's still interesting that kind of the rules of compliance, the envelope was pushed a little bit within this setting here. We have kind of a raucous set of Democrats here in Washington County anyway. Who are
They're
pretty vocal.
passionate people, and I love that about people that are committed to having a voice in our process.
And somebody was very passionate about vaccinations.
Oh dear, that was a little scary. It was towards the end, and I was sitting about halfway back in the auditorium, and then I saw this tall, lanky fellow just stride right down the aisle, up the stair steps onto the stage, and right over to not so tall Chris Stewart, and kind of lean over, and into the mic he blurted, "Vaccinations cause autism. Vaccinations cause autism." And then one of our organizers here, Henry Walton, who's in charge of our Institute of Politics and Public Affairs, he was one of the first people up on the stage. I think it caught some security people off their feet
A
a
little
bit.
off guard.
Yeah, so.
Interesting.
And it was an interesting moment for me personally because this fellow was quite tall, and Chris is not very tall, and it was I thought to myself, I had this sickening feeling that Congressman Stewart was very vulnerable.
Was in danger that way?
Well, very vulnerable in that moment, and it created a lot of sympathy for me, for him as a human being, an individual. And I thought, wow, how does this happen? You know, how these people, these are representatives.
Elected. Oh, bless you.
Excuse me. Our representatives, they make a lot of sacrifices in our behalf.
Yeah.
I mean, we all know about the people who aggrandize themselves, but a lot of our representatives make a lot of sacrifices in our behalf, and in some cases, it's putting their well-being maybe at jeopardy.
So we discussed this a little bit before yesterday as we were talking about the show today, and it raised some questions in my mind. To have that kind of activity emboldened by other types of public events as well. Are the gloves coming off here civilly? You talk about what's appropriate or pushing that
our norms,
that edge as far as the norms are concerned. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I was responding to that through the lens of my public discourse class. It's called Voice and Civility in Public Discourse, and I'm feeling a lot like sometimes it's so important to get a message out. Look at the anonymous letter last week. So important to get a message out that sometimes we have to violate norms in order to be heard. Because my class is really about how to be heard as a citizen, how to advocate in a persuasive way for your point of view and what your needs are as a citizen. And I had some sympathy, not particularly for the content of the message about vaccinations causing autism. I tend to be trusting, even though I'm getting less trusting and more skeptical as I get older. I'm not a skeptic about vaccinations. They make me uneasy, but still there's enough.
No, I get that, but obviously it was off topic unless vaccination somehow came up.
Oh no,
in the
it was
debate.
very clearly I need to get this message out. I need to have my voice heard.
Reason.
Yes.
Was the microphone just the first in proximity to him?
I would say so.
He didn't crush Shireen Gorbani to get to Chris Stewart.
Correct.
So it was just happened to be the closest microphone, not necessarily a threat.
Right.
Or a political statement as to whose mic he went to.
Correct, and I would say it was effective in getting that message out there.
Oh, really?
I'm not sure it makes that message look more or less credible, but it definitely gets it heard.
Well, the message is out there, but you have to consider the audience, and certainly that audience wasn't there or wasn't expecting.
Heavens no.
That interjection of an agenda.
But the audience had, like you said, the message is out there, so it wasn't like the first time they'd heard that message.
So what's the credibility, though, to that message?
Well, okay, depending on who you ask. Some people would say it's a very credible message, and other people say it's complete hysteria.
Well, that comes back to the message, the messenger.
Oh, in that case?
The way they delivered the message, the context of the delivering of that message. One of the biggest problems, we talked about this last night, I don't know what is happening outside there.
It sounds like it's windy or something.
It sounds like the ceiling's going to cave in here. I talked about this last night with my argumentation critical thinking class as far as losing credibility, not being able to accurately represent the message because people don't give the messenger the credibility that they're looking for, or they're out of context and being able to go through and
right. And see, I was very sympathetic to his approach.
You were
I was definitely, because I think sometimes that out of context, that shock, that little abrupt in your face can be very effective with people as far as getting their attention. Not necessarily changing somebody's mind. I wouldn't say it was going to change anybody's mind.
No, it wasn't persuasive by...
Right, but it does bring it to the surface of awareness temporarily. Okay. For me anyway. So I'm somewhat sympathetic. Not that I would encourage my students to violate, I wouldn't say to my class, okay, during the debate. Be
disruptive?
Yeah, right. I wouldn't advocate that.
But disruption is the new norm.
And I guess I'm somewhat sympathetic to that being a necessity sometimes. Because see, look at it this way, maybe the rules that are in place are there to manage messaging. And so
Manage messaging or
in
manage the
favor of
messenger?
well, the messenger and the messaging in favor of the establishment or the power structure.
Sure, okay.
So if your message is not compatible with the established messaging, and you're anti that and you're disruptive of that,
We're getting really academic here, so bear with us as we flesh this out because it's important to understand.
you know what I'm saying? I'm
Yeah.
saying sometimes you have to push back in awkward ways in order to make your point.
So a great example of what we're talking about is is Kavanaugh's hearings.
Okay.
As disruptive as both Democrats and Republicans were.
Okay.
Republicans maybe being a response to the Democratic disruption and
Okay.
coming out and saying we're not adequately prepared, he's not adequately vetted, we haven't had a chance to look at the documents, and there was that constant pushback against the Speaker of the committee to
Grassley?
to adjourn, against Grassley to adjourn and to wait until they had things considered. And then obviously the other disruptions that were happening by the peanut gallery too. Have you ever watched a parliamentary proceeding in Great Britain?
Oh, it's so animated. It's so lively. It's really fascinating.
It's the model of civil disruption.
Okay.
I think it is. I was explaining to my class last night that there used to be a time back in the 90s when a parliamentary member would stand up and he put his hand on his head and put his other hand out in order to put out his proposition. And the reason why they would do that was to keep their wig from falling off their heads. And then, no wigs anymore, but they're still doing, now they've dropped that altogether. But all this part of the pomp and disruption of
And the theater?
and the theater of politics of what's happening there, and we have that now more than we ever have before.
Maybe we're just more keenly aware. I'm thinking of the Lincoln Douglas
Or are we
debates.
angrier?
Talk about theater, though. With
Sure.
Yeah. So maybe there's always been theater, and it's always been a form of entertainment for the masses, going clear back to Rome and ancient Greece.
Are we more escalated now than we have been? Do you think, in terms of how divided we've become?
Well, I keep looking at colonial rhetoric in the United States, and I would say that's about as divisive as I've ever heard. So I don't know about more divisive either.
We're at a disadvantage there, obviously, because we don't have a way to discern the paralinguistics of that colonial rhetoric. We don't know how they sounded when they delivered that rhetoric, what the emphasis
Well, if you just look at the written rhetoric, it's
Sure.
pretty
And
intense.
we might be able to imagine what that sounded like as it goes. A majority of the messages that we're putting out there is nonverbal as opposed to the content that we're speaking. Today, though, wow, it seems pretty polarizing.
Well, so then I was listening to this speculation about whether or not Dr. Blasey will be testifying on Monday at Brett Kavanaugh's. And here's a potential bias
So
I might be hearing.
Hold on to that.
Okay.
And I'm with you.
Okay.
But give us some context
Okay.
for those who might not know what you're
right.
talking about.
Okay, so Brett Kavanaugh's been going through his Senate Judiciary
Right.
hearings as the Trump presidency's nomination
Okay.
for the Supreme Court seat vacated by Kennedy's retirement,
Okay.
right? And there was a lot, like you referred to just a minute ago, a lot of animation and discussion previous to that during the week. And then late in the week, a woman came forward, or it became public at that point.
So Dianne Feinstein came forward with a letter
Right.
that she'd received on the 30th of July, not months ago, to clarify, as was indicated by President Trump yesterday. The Democrats didn't know about this months ago. They knew about it. Actually, they didn't know about it because Feinstein didn't bother to tell the rest of the Democrats on the committee until much later about the
Officially,
letter.
anyway. I mean, she
right.
had some staff that knew, and
Right.
it was leaking out in town.
Yeah, how do you
Right.
not? Okay.
Right.
So, and the letter indicated that
That this woman had been assaulted in high school by Brett Kavanaugh, and
also in high school.
also in high school, and so possibly they were both minors when it happened. I don't know what year in high school they were. and that she had suffered some trauma from it, had gone to counseling over it, had been advised to discuss it with her husband, et cetera, and felt like it should be made public. And I believe besides Feinstein, there was also a referral to another agency. I can't remember.
Well, the FBI was the other agency involved.
Right from the beginning
in
when Feinstein was?
Yeah, from what I understand, from what I've heard reporting-wise.
Right. So it's been out there for a little while, but it was withheld. And she wanted to remain anonymous. And I really do, it's hard to guess what Feinstein's been thinking about it as far as releasing it or not. But I can see how she'd be reticent to release it if it wasn't absolutely necessary to avoid his hasty confirmation, because this woman did want to remain anonymous.
Yeah, so there's a lot of accusations that is indeed the tactic of Dianne Feinstein to
The timing around it.
to put that out there at
So
such a point.
would she maybe never have released it, do we think?
If it didn't
If
leak?
this confirmation wasn't going forward,
Yeah,
maybe?
we could armchair quarterback this thing all day
Right.
long.
And speculate.
Yeah, I don't know. But again, the skeptic in me goes through and says,
Two things come up for me, one
Okay.
around bias and one around critical thinking
right,
on it.
what are they? But you were
Well, around
indicating-
bias,
yeah.
okay. So when I hear the news coverage of it, I hear the assault being possibly perpetrated by Judge Kavanaugh. Instead of Brett Kavanaugh, high school student. I feel like that's a contextual nuance that's important. And I feel like, to be as fair as possible to the mature adult Judge Kavanaugh, that to refer to this incident that happened possibly 36 years ago, it's more fair to phrase it in terms of Brett Kavanaugh, high school student. What do you think?
Don't you run a risk, though, in going through and saying, well, these are just kids and they didn't know better?
I'm not going that far. I'm not going that far. But I do think there's a distinction between Brett Kavanaugh.
Yeah, that's as far as the critics are going, though, with that kind of thinking, that
Maybe.
the Brett Kavanaugh in high school is not so different than Judge Kavanaugh currently.
Well, okay, so that goes into the whole area of can people change, and do they change?
Right.
And then you could argue also that the human brain now is not fully developed.
Sure.
Until the
He was
mid-20s.
less than 29 years old.
Right.
Hadn't hit that threshold.
And here's another thing, the influence of alcohol at this party. And this is the thing that really, critical thinking wise, surprises me.
But do we just end up justifying the action
No,
based on
no.
those contextual ideas?
Don't think asking these questions leads to justifying it. I think they're valid questions to ask. And the other thing that keeps coming up is the one report I heard, detailed report, said there was another young man in the room when this was happening, and that both of them, at one degree or another, participated in this. Where's this
Yeah, where's the other
corroborating evidence? Where's this other person who was supposedly there? It doesn't seem to come up. It came up that one time I heard a detailed description, and it's never come up again since.
Right.
That seems to me to be a major factor in this whole discussion.
Right, I'm sure there are agencies who are actively figuring that out, or they
Why
know who
why
that
doesn't the
is.
media mention that at all? Why
There has been some mention in the media that I've heard, but nothing
Wouldn't
really
you say it's kind
forthcoming.
of
It's a little weird.
minimized?
Yeah, it's a little strange.
And so-
instead, what I'm hearing is kind of a false parallelism in bringing forth Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill's exchange during Judge Thomas's confirmation hearings as well.
Why are you saying it's a false parallel?
Well, because the context there are very different. While we're talking about Brett Kavanaugh and Blasey, is that?
Blasey, Dr. Blasey.
Dr. Blasey. And she's a PhD professor that
In
way.
California.
In California. But we talk about them in terms of the high school context, at a party, in a situation that many are trying to go through and excuse, if not contextualize, versus a working relationship between Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas
As
adults, where the accusation of sexual harassment is on a different, do I say that? Contextually, it's different
Okay.
there
Adults in a working environment, young people at a party.
at a party.
Okay. I grant you
And
there's a
I think
difference
there's
there.
a false parallel in trying to pull those together. In fact, I'm not sure it does the case any harm or any good, one way or the other. But it doesn't make sense to me to go through and say, oh,
Really?
this is Anita Hill all over again,
Oh,
because
see.
it's not.
I totally. Okay, that's a difference. Okay, it's a difference, but it doesn't, to me, eliminate the parallel because, in both cases, the woman's complaint is now germane to the idea of confirming that person to sit on the Supreme Court.
Right.
So
Agreed.
that's exactly.
And they come down to a he said, she said
Unless
scenario.
this missing corroborating evidence person surfaces.
Yeah, so far
Yeah.
what I've understood though from the special committee that's going to convene next week is there will only be 2 witnesses.
Well,
Period.
Why?
Well, that's the rules. I'm not sure why, and I'm wondering. So we have yet to hear, as of yesterday, whether or not Blase's attorney has actually agreed to
Correct.
the hearing. I looked this morning. I couldn't find any confirmation that that's still the case. So they're still waiting to hear from that camp whether or not they will appear at the hearing. And I'm wondering if there's not some kind of negotiation happening in terms of, well, maybe there is a corroborating witness and we want them there, but you are only limiting us to Kavanaugh and Blase.
And one thing I did hear in the reporting is that she has taken and passed a polygraph test on the incident, and I thought, well, why not? I wonder if Judge Kavanaugh would be willing to take a polygraph test.
It's going to boil down to in my mind at least, an analysis of their testimonies both verbally and non-verbally.
Well,
How
I hope
convincing
not.
what else are we going to go off of when there's really no palatable evidence out there to one side or the other?
Well, maybe a polygraph test would be valid, and then maybe this other witness.
Polygraphs are a 50-50.
I mean, there were a lot of people at that party, and Judge Kavanaugh is saying he wasn't even attending that party. Well, okay, you people that were there, let's hear from them, They weren't the only 2 people in the house.
Yeah, from what I understand, Judge Kavanaugh kind of self-implied that he was at the party because he had indicated before the details of the infraction were ever released. He denied it, indicating he wasn't at that party or at that residence or at that time when the details of the offense weren't ever released to begin with. And so there's kind of a self-incrimination going on.
Well, why does this matter? Why does the confirmation and the length of time it takes to confirm Judge Kavanaugh matter in a political sense? So there's the
Well, there
ethicals.
are a number of things at
Okay.
work here. Obviously, first one is the conservative majority potential represented by the appointing of Judge Kavanaugh, which the Democrats, liberals are going to be hard pressed to go through and see that they can intervene there, that they can go through and prevent that from happening.
Mm-hmm.
It also sets up, though, if in terms of the allegation, in my mind, is this double moral standard that's more than developing here in the United States. We have a president who is accused with pretty powerful evidence out there of an adulterous affair, not with one, but 2 individuals.
And sexual harassment, and yeah.
So are we okay with Kavanaugh, pressing himself against the will of a young woman in a high school? They're just kids, we're okay with that, and we're going to dismiss it and
Or
move
maybe
on?
some of us are willing to swallow it because
Well, they're willing to swallow Trump's infractions.
we want that conservative majority so badly, we're willing to swallow this.
You're willing to subjugate your moral ground.
Maybe.
That's a pretty sad state for
I
this
think
country
there
to
are
be in.
people that voted for President Trump because of this court majority. It was such a big deal.
Well, obviously, as it carries over from Obama's attempt to appoint a Supreme Court justice and how that was completely overruled, bulldozed, is probably a better term, by the powers that be, where he's had obviously the constitutional right to proceed with that, and yet it was shut down. This is a big deal.
It is, and part of me sitting here thinking, that's politics. That's the fighting that goes on at the political level. The dirty tricks and the manipulation and the power struggles are part of the messiness of democracy.
Yeah, but what does that messiness say about the people?
As individuals, I mean, their personal ethics and morals.
Yeah.
They're saying it's worth it to get what it's worth it for my party to win, or they're
It's
saying
worth it to have an adulterer. It's worth it to have
if we get that judge
predator,
on the court.
to get the judge that we want, to go through then and rule for the very morals that we've abandoned in supporting the president. I can't think of a greater hypocrisy than that.
It's pretty intense.
Wow.
I think that's the reasoning for some people. What do you think?
I don't know how to speak to that and not
do you think
break
that-
out in profanity.
Okay.
I'm enraged. It's a
The ends
contradiction
justify the means.
of character,
Yes.
though.
Yeah.
And it does not speak well to us as
Yeah.
the people.
Well, what are you going to do when you have this form of government instead of the type we might have in Russia, where one person says this is what needs to be done, and I'll tolerate no fussing around, no real fussing
No,
around.
I think that's it's like defending Trump and using Obama in your
to
defense
say what
to go
about
through and
the
say,
whole what about thing.
right.
Well,
It boils down to the people. It comes down to people saying, we're not going to stand for this, regardless if the ends justify the means or not.
so is it all on about 4 or 5 Republican senators right now?
Yes, it is,
It
absolutely.
is. Jeff Flake, who's retiring,
Orrin Hatch.
Murkowski and
Murkowski
Collins.
and Collins, right?
I think I know where Hatch is with this. Don't think.
Yeah,
he-
there's no question there.
don't
Oh, you're
think-
talking about the swing votes that are going on.
Yes.
Right.
For the nomination.
So we have, forgive me, I can't remember the names of the two female.
Collins and
Collins and
Murkowski.
Murkowski, okay.
Yeah.
Right, who, strong. They're going to be lobbied heavily
And
here.
so is Jeff Flake. I think he's on the fence, and I think Bob Corker is a fourth name that I've heard mentioned. They're just like, this is not a slam dunk for us. So I mean, that's
That's the moral voice of the
hear
GOP?
you hear that voice in my heritage. The Constitution will hang by a thread.
Oh.
Well, listen, don't you feel like
How many times have we been able to make that application here?
Maybe
we
a-
thought Mitt Romney was going to be the one who's going to
Hang
go
by a
through
thread?
and rescue that hang by a thread
But
Constitution.
maybe it's always been, think about early on in the days, the colonial days, when there was all of this paranoia and fear about going back to a monarchy. Maybe it's always hanging by a thread, and as of citizens, if we don't get our act together and stand up for the moral right, stand up against the political pressures,
When
maybe.
you say the moral right, do you mean that in terms of a political leaning or right
No.
as in correct?
I mean, as what's moral, like standing up for truth and justice.
standard.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
I just
and
want to
respect
clarify.
for.
Because there are those who believe that that there's no moral left. Wow, there's a double entendre there as well.
Oh yeah. All right. No moral left. There is a moral left.
Yes.
Definitely, there's a moral left. Absolutely.
Well, that's infuriating. Well, I hope you have something to say about this, and if you do, please comment on our Facebook. It's at facebook.com/talkingpointlive. You spent another 30 minutes here eavesdropping here on our conversation. We'd love to know what you think.
Yeah, we're really hoping that it's thought-provoking and maybe sparks some conversation in your households with friends and family who matter to you, and that as citizens you'll take some of these challenges to heart.
Or even more so, that you take your passions to the voting poll
Yes.
in November, and that you make it known. That's other than pitchforks and burning torches, not tiki torches, that you make your voices known. You make it heard out there. All right. All right.
Okay, until next week, who knows what's going to be happening.
Good conversation. We'll keep an eye on the news and let you know.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us with Talking Point Live.